Hey there, I'm Ryan and welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll also have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, this channel is predominantly fan-funded, so if you feel like you're enjoying, you're having fun, you're learning things, do consider checking out the Patreon. We do have a lot of fun things up there on top of the reference photos and traceables, like that of my ebooks, and even a bunch of polls. So, a bunch of fun stuff. Do check it out if you're enjoying. But with that, let's jump into it and have some fun. We're going to begin here today with a 9 by 12 inch canvas and a 1 inch flat-headed brush. From there, I'll dip the bottom third into some water, condensing our bristles and ensuring that our paint does stay wet for a longer period of time. With that, on to step number 1. So we're going to begin by taking quite a bit of titanium white, moving that down here on our palette. We'll use one corner of our brush to grab a hint of Mars Black and wipe off the excess, because it really is quite a strong pigment. Then with the other corner of our brush, we'll grab about a similar amount of Ultramarine blue, again wiping off the excess, and we'll blend those together right here to get a nice cool gray. And we'll use this for our sky. You can see that I am going back a couple of times, grabbing additional blue, and I very rarely go with the first mixture I end up with. I think it's good to take your time, figure out really what you want it to be. And again, just don't feel like you have to settle. So with that, grabbing quite a bit of paint, applying that up at the top of my canvas, where we'll have some openings in the trees. We will need to do 2 to 3 layers here, just because acrylic paints are inherently quite thin. But I like that a lot. It's not too vibrant, it's not too bright, and I think it'll complement the greens and our trees fairly well. So I'm going to let this dry. I'm going to do a second layer, and then we'll go in to the next step. Now we're going to start mixing the base layer for our background, and we're going to start with a very minimal amount of titanium white, quite a bit of our golden green right here, and then about half the amount of green that we used in Mars Black. This is going to render a fairly dark green. The white that we interjected, and we'll do a little bit more, is going to desaturate it because it's going to mix with the Mars Black in there, make a bit of a gray, and right now I want a nice dark green for the background. Not as dark as the darkest pigments that we have here because we're going to apply them in a later layer, but something that's kind of middle of the road dark, kind of like all of this protruding foliage that we have. So I'm actually very happy with this, and we're going to now start applying it to the canvas. So at this point, we're going to continue utilizing the 1 inch flat-headed brush because, as you can see, it covers this canvas incredibly quickly, and I am going to go over the entirety of my sketch. I get a lot of questions about why I do this sketch when I know I'm going to cover it up with all of this. And that's really just because I want the practice. I want to know that I'm going to like everything where it is a little bit later on. Gets me familiar with the actual piece. And I think it's just a general great first step. Though we will be drawing it back on a little bit later with some Conte or chalk. With that, I am going back and remixing more of my pigment, rather than just kind of scraping in what we already have there on the canvas. We do want this base layer to be quite thick, and if we were to, I'll show you, just continue to move this out, you see that you really begin to get that tooth of the canvas, that grain. Sometimes if you have a large body of paint and another large body of paint, you can kind of fill in a specific area using an X-shaped pattern like this, and then smooth it out with something more horizontal. But for the most part, you really do want to apply brand new paint, as that's going to give you the best results. I'm also crafting this line here between our lake and our trees through a series of little strokes. Now at this point, I should be able to blend into this bottom area with relative ease. Because my brush is pretty damp, we are working on a fairly large area, and that does, can raise issues with acrylic painting, but if your brush is a little bit damp, you should be able to do things just like this and continue to work upwards. Now up here it's going to get quite interesting because we have a lot of our sky. I'm actually going to cover the majority of the sky, and I'll show you what I mean. We're going to start implementing what will be some trees. And I'm just rotating my brush in the air, going in with a little bit of a tap. This is meant to be quite rough. We will refine later on. But as you can see, we start in that body, we work our way out, we start to run out of paint, it gets more and more thin. You get this nice little cluster of foliage look, just like that. We'll blend our larger body of green into this as well. There we go. And now yet again, I find myself close to that top area, so there's a lot of tapping, there's a little bit of a drag effect. You can see that it's fairly bright because you can see the blue through this pigment, which actually looks really nice. But we can do the actual detail work with a smaller brush in a little bit. Right now, again, we're just focusing on that base layer. The majority of this lesson will be done in real time, by the way, but there are going to be some repetitive points or sections like this where there really isn't too much to visually or audibly expand upon, so I will be speeding up a little bit of the footage just so the lesson isn't like 6 hours long and still remains fairly digestible while, giving you all of the information that I can. With that, on to the next step. So for our next step, we're going to look to create some of the texture, some of the detail that we have in the darker areas of these trees. To do so, we'll grab some Mars Black and we'll actually just work this into our previous mixture. We still want it to have a bit of green in it. We don't want it to be a pure Mars Black, but we do want it to be darker. And I think this is actually really, really nice. You can tell a difference between that and that. You can tell a difference between that and that. With that, let's get to our next brush and the following step. Next we'll be working with a 1/2 inch flat-headed brush, and as you can see, the bristles are much more stiff on this one, which is actually going to be quite advantageous for our next step. I'm going to be doing a lot of tapping, and all of these little bristles are going to render their own little impression on the canvas. So with that, onto the canvas. So now we're going to take some of that paint, not too much because we don't want to kind of overload the bristles here, and then we're going to go in with a very faint tapping effect. Now, I'm trying to rotate my brush as we proceed. I'm trying to leave lots of little openings in between all of these taps. And as we tend to move out from our initial area, our pigment will get more faint because, of course, we are just running out of paint. So again, just a nice way to kind of practice your gradients here. We don't actually want a real gradient at the end of this, but we are just starting the painting off. We are getting those fine motor skills firing, so you might as well just kind of have some fun with it. We're also going to make an effort to ensure that the bottom area here has more coverage, because the top is going to be a lot brighter. And this is really that detailed texture, that shadow that we get in between all of our leaves and foliage. And of course, the farther we get down here in the painting, the less light that can find its way. So we have that area. I'm now going to get more paint, and I'll just go over it again. Every time we do this, we will lose more of that green background that we initially painted, and that is okay here at the bottom. And I did note earlier that, very recently, that we weren't actually going to be rendering a gradient in this, but we are, because we do want the bottom area to be quite a bit darker. With that, I am going to get you a little bit closer so you can really see the technique. So I mixed up some additional paint here because we did need more, and I wanted to note at this point that while we made our 1-inch flat-headed brush quite damp to spread and blend all of this backing layer, I did not wet this brush at all, because when you wet your brush, you condense all of the bristles. Normally great for rendering very consistent strokes, not having any stray bristles. However, here we really want the stray bristles. They are what is creating all of these beautiful little effects. So it's important that we keep this one nice and dry. Now, at a certain point, if you do this for a while, you are going to have to wet your brush. You won't really have a choice, otherwise the pigment will dry and you will ruin the bristles. But when that happens, switch to another one, or just dry off your brush really, really well. Now, as I get higher up here, I'm going to go over areas less frequently. I'm going to leave more of that green opening. So we have that gradient of tighter clusters down here, it's darker, to looser clusters up here that, again, let more of that light through. Let's go back to a wide shot. So, jumping back into it, I am going to finish off this bottom area and then continue to work my way upwards, again rotating my brush in the air in between taps. You don't want to do it once your brush has already touched the canvas, because then you will render a lot of strokes, which is not ideal. And I'd also like to note that when we start to get a lot higher here and we have these more grand openings in between our taps, things are less visually complicated, I am going to randomly select areas like this and make it quite a bit darker. You can see that there's a little pathway. We kind of have one over here too. I just want more diversity, because the shadows that we see through these trees aren't all going to be equal. Some are going to be deeper in the foliage. They're going to be receiving even less light. So having that randomized factor is going to aid the painting, though you do want the majority of them down here at the bottom. And you will see that I go back to that a number of times and just continue to touch it up. But with that, the process does get pretty repetitive, so I think we'll put on some music, we'll speed up this next portion, and I will see you for the next step. Now we're going to switch over to a 1/2-inch flat-headed brush. This one is a bit more clean, the bristles are a bit more soft, it is also synthetic, and I want this because the top of it, as you can see, is really quite sharp, and this will be fantastic for rendering distant trees. So our current goal is to render the trees that we have in the real distance here. They are going to be fairly gray, so we'll start off with some titanium white, about half that of Mars Black, because Mars Black is a much stronger pigment, and then, we'll give that a go. I think it'll be too bright. It is definitely far too bright, so we'll add in about double our Mars Black, mix that up, test that. And that looks really, really close. It's a bit brighter, which I'm actually okay with, but I'm also going to add in the smallest hint of green, because we are going to have some reflected green light in the middle of our forest, and we can also have, subjects like moss on our tree. So this to me looks fantastic. Again, a little bit brighter, but I do want slightly more contrast. So with that, let's jump onto the canvas. Alright, so jumping into this, we are going to take our brush, make sure that we don't have much pigment on said brush, because we do want a smaller application. And then I'm just going to tap on the body of our tree. As we start to move farther down, we're going to run out of paint, I'm going to need to apply slightly more pressure. And that actually really isn't a bad thing because the tree should get bigger as you move towards the bottom. Now, I do want this to get lost in the bottom of our foliage, so I'm actually going to relieve pressure here. I may skip a little spot and then maybe I'll do another little tap to imply that it is going behind some of our past foliage. So from there, I'll just grab some extra water to condense my bristles, grab some extra paint, check my reference photo, just make sure that we're doing this in the right spot, and you can use some chalk or Conte to redraw on where your trees are if you don't want to kind of freehand it as you go like I am right here. But right now I am just looking up. Okay, I see a small tree right here. We can do that. And I'm doing all of the applications here with a series of smaller taps because I don't want a perfect soft looking tree. If you were to take your brush and move down the canvas, you would get a very clean application, but that really isn't what we're looking for here. We want something that is a lot more organic looking, and this definitely renders that aesthetic. Here I'm being much more open with my applications. You can see an opening there, an opening there, an opening there. Again, just trying to make it look like these are weaving in and out of some of this distant foliage. Now we'll move over here a little bit. I'm also not painting the prominent trees right now. These really are just the distant ones. We'll use a brighter value for the ones more so in the foreground, and I'll also go ahead and make them thicker. Though most of my trees will start this thin anyway, because it's much easier to make your trees thicker than it is to make them thinner. Starting to run out of paint here, playing a risky game. We'll skip some spaces. I think that looks nice. Okay, I'll get you closer as we finish up the last 4 or 5 over on the left-hand side. So here we are, yet again. We'll grab some of that pigment with a nice, clean, recently made damp brush. I'll start at the top because generally, again, it's easier to get those smaller applications when we're just starting. We're making our trees different heights. Did a little bit of a drag there, that was by accident. Instead, this is what we should be doing, going in with a tap, going in with a tap, going in with a tap. You can see that this is a bit more of a rough look than that, which is also ideal because we are working with pretty organic subjects. Going to make my brush nice and damp again. We'll head even higher. Oh, that's nice. Okay, so I accidentally grabbed a little bit of a brighter pigment, but I think that it actually works quite well, and we might make this into one of our more prominent trees a little bit later. But because it's brighter, you can really see the texture and the technique that you get from the tapping effect rather than the drag effect. So that's pretty neat. We will grab some additional Mars Black, work that into our mixture, and then we'll come back with another distant, small application. You can also tweak your color as you go with this. Make it darker if you want, make it brighter. Diversity is a good thing. And speaking of diversity, it's not in the reference photo, but I'm going to do it anyway. Occasionally creating trees that crisscross are fantastic. Having the look that one of them is kind of fallen, it's really interesting. I like that. So now we're going to start rendering a pigment for the semi-highlighted foliage. This isn't going to be for the trees that are in the foreground and the foliage that is in the foreground. It's still going to be relatively dark because it's a bit farther back in our landscape here. But we are looking to render the greens that are right back here. Again, not the ones that are in the foreground, not those, but these. And I think this is actually quite close with a little bit more titanium white. we may have it. I wanted to show you a bit of a closer shot here, and I really am trying to get the highlights in the background. These, of course, aren't going to be as bright as these because it'll have the shadows of everything else, the deeper it is into the woods. But I think this is actually really perfect, and with that, we'll mix up some more and start applying it to the canvas. Now we're going to switch here to the fan brush, and I want to use this because it has a fairly linear top to it. So by using this and tapping it into the canvas, you can render these longer applications of foliage that really look quite organic. So let's grab some paint and do just that. So now we're going to take that brush, make sure that it's nice and damp, and then we'll come to the side of one of our trees. And we'll just start tapping on some highlights. So you can see how it extends out that way. I'll rotate the brush so that I get a different set of taps this time. We'll move down the tree. This time we'll extend a bit farther. And you know what, we'll go to the other side as well. Something I do want to avoid is having them go on the exact same kind of trajectory on both sides. I want, maybe it to be a little bit higher on the right, then maybe a little bit lower on the left. Then we'll take some extra space. But you essentially don't want it to be completely even all the time, because realistically, these are going to extend and protrude at different areas of the tree, behind it, in front of it, not just left and right, right? Now we'll jump to another tree. And you can see that I'm really jumping back and forth between both sides at this point. You'll probably want to do this more so with the more prominent, larger areas. And with that, once we're done this one, let's get you a little bit closer. So here we go. New paint, wet brush. We'll head over to the side of this tree, do a little bit of a draping effect through taps. Head over to the other side of the tree. Skip a little bit of space right there. Maybe have another portion that kind of comes down. Constantly trying to make these different and ever-changing. I'm also going over the main top area of each a couple of times to build more so of a cohesive looking spine for it. A larger branch that it all can kind of move off of. There we go. This is the background too, it's worth noting. So here I really don't want to do too much detail, and I also don't want my applications to be too bright or too saturated. This is meant to complement the piece, not meant to be the most engaging subject in the piece when it's all said and done. Here I'll also move it more so down and in front. And you can tell that this mixture is actually a little bit brighter than our past. Changing it as we go is nice. Again, it adds diversity, it makes it more interesting, though you really don't want to go too bright with any of it. With that, I think we'll take another step back, and we'll just continue working through these together. So from there, we're going to head back to the 1/2 inch flat-headed brush, and we'll start rendering another gray similar to this, but a little bit brighter. So here, as you can see, we're already incorporating a slightly more titanium white, and I think this is definitely the right step. So now we'll test it right in there. I think that the value is very correct, but this is definitely a bit more green. Again, we will get that reflected light. We will get mosses. So we'll grab a very small amount, wipe off the excess, work that in, and give it another go. And I think that is pretty much next to perfect. We will need to go back for a slightly brighter version, but for now I'm very happy. So here we are back at the canvas, and as you can see, I've sketched in a couple of the trees for our foreground. Again, really just following the reference photo, but I would like to note that I did the drawing with a little bit of Conte. It's a lot like a chalk, but you can allocate different colors and it's generally pretty fine, which is great because if we don't necessarily love something, we can take it off very easily with just a little bit of water. That said, this process is quite similar to how we were previously working in all of these trees. Starting with a very fine tap at the top, we work our way down, we start to apply slightly more pressure. Though, with our first rendition, we were doing a lot of skipping areas so that the foliage looked like it was working in and around. We're not going to do that this time. Right now, we are simply making our elongated trees, and we're ensuring that they connect all the way through. We will be adding foliage on top. With that, yet again, let's get you a little bit closer. So here we are. While I generally like to start at the top, I wanted to show you a number of them quite close together. And because the heights vary dramatically, I thought, you know what, we'd start here at the bottom. It's good to have general rules, but it's also good to understand that you can break them here and there. With that, as I go about this, I do try to ensure that my edges, while continuously shifting to the right and left, are fairly consistent, fairly sharp. So occasionally I do a little bit of a drag for these larger ones. So I'll do a tap and then I'll do a little bit of a drag down. Just like that. That way we still get that organic movement, but we also have a nice sharp edge, which I should actually go back and do to this one over here, and you can really see that comparison. There we are. Also make sure to bring it all the way to the bottom. There we go. Now that we have our darker gray base layer for our trees, we're going to start mixing up the lighter one to layer on top. This is going to add a lot of depth. It'll make it look like light is wrapping around our subject, and of course the variance simply in the values of our subjects is also going to help a lot. So with that, I'm just mixing up a brighter gray right here. We will still grab the smallest hint of green, and you can see that I'm wiping off a lot of excess on the side there. We do want it to look organic, but we don't want it to blend in too much with everything else. So I'll try that right here, and I can tell that it's too bright for that area, but we'll try these trees as well. And that is actually really fantastic. We could even go a little bit brighter, and I like that we have that room to play. So we'll go in with this, and then if we need something brighter, we'll also grab that. So going into this here, I'm going to be fairly mindful of which trees I'm applying this to, and I'm going to apply it predominantly to the front of them. So a number of these have become relatively large, And we want to ensure that that area right, well, that's facing us, is going to be receiving the majority of this light and highlight. I'm also trying really hard to ensure that we still have those spaces in between, and we can even create more of them because we have that base layer that's already establishing the trees. You can see that these are now really popping out, and we almost have 3 levels of highlight. I'm not doing a drag effect with this. We don't need to create pristine edging because we're working more so in the middle. And you know what? I think I'll get you a little bit closer for our next layer. Now with this tree over here on the right hand side of the canvas, I'm actually going to have the applications that we have here dissipate as we move towards the bottom. Because in the reference photo it shows that there's more of a shadow down here. So I'm going to apply this to the top. I'll skip a bit of an area, do a little bit of a highlight, skip a bit of an area, just a tiny tap, and I think that's all we'll do for that tree. But we created a lot of variance. I think it's really quite interesting. And then I'll move back towards the middle one and apply some additional highlight. This one's really going to be capturing the majority of the attention in the piece. And I do want it to be the brightest, the largest, the most prominent. And we will have the bottom area be brighter as well, in comparison to this one at least. But I like that. I think we'll also add a little bit of highlight to one of these distant trees. Perhaps it's protruding past a lot of those shadows. Just going in with that very soft tap, and we're getting some real texture in here too. Despite the fact that it's a fairly condensed brush with fairly condensed bristles, we are getting some variance, and I like that. It looks like there are little pieces of the trees that are sticking out and catching light. It's really quite attractive. Might also add just a little bit over here. But again, we don't want to add it to all of them because we want to ensure that there is that variance and that depth. Now we're going to head over to the left-hand side. I'm going to use my pinky finger to brace my hand, that way I can eliminate some shake. And I'm just going to finish off with this tree right here. Will have to remove my finger just so I can get the right angle. There we go. Often, rather than holding your brush like this, it's better to hold your brush from farther back. You get more of a natural application. It's a little bit more difficult to be precise, but that can be actually a good thing. And if you ever take any formal art training, they'll generally implore you to hold your brush from farther away rather than like a pencil. I think that you should do whatever works best for you, whatever you enjoy the most. This is meant to be a enjoyable, cathartic process. So don't kind of just let everybody tell you exactly what to do. But as a general suggestion, holding your brush from a bit farther away is generally ideal. Though sometimes going in, getting closer, and using your pinky finger can really help you get those fine details working well. See that I'm jumping back and forth between a number of them, just making sure it's exactly what I want it to be. But with that, I think I'm quite happy, and I think we're ready for our next step. So now it's time to have some fun with our foreground foliage, all of the little protruding pieces from the trees that really stick out. We're going to start with some of our golden green, about an equal mixture of a titanium white, about half that in Mars black, and this will probably darken it more than we want, but it will desaturate all of that green because the black and the white are mixing. Then we'll add in a little bit more of our white here. I think that is a really beautiful color. Might be a little bright. We'll give it a go. Definitely a little bit bright. We'll try it over here. That's closer to what we want. I think we need to just add some extra Mars black though. tone it down, make those values a little bit darker, go in again, and it's slightly brighter than what we have here on the reference photo. On the right hand side, it's just right for what we have in the middle, so I'm really quite happy with this. I think we'll go with it, and then we'll probably brighten up the trees in the middle in just a minute, though we are going to switch our brush for the actual application. Now we're going to switch over to a very small liner brush, and this is fantastic for making incredibly small details. I love it for leaves, foliage, really any detail in bark, and we are going to use it right now for the foliage. So when I look at our reference photo, we can tell that a lot of that highlighted foliage is right here in the middle tree. Then we have some off to the side with this one, a little bit more so at the top here, and then we'll deal with that area in just a second. With that, I will make my brush fairly damp. We will grab our palette, some of that nice green, and then we're going to start using a series of taps to create a lot of the protruding branches that are going to be implied. We're not actually going to paint on the branches. At this point, they'd be small to the point where we don't really see them. So instead, we're just painting the greenery here in such a way that implies that it's being attached. I'm going to try to avoid areas on the left and right hand side working directly across from one another. It occasionally will be necessary. And as you've probably noticed, at this point we only have worked to the left and right hand side. However, this greenery, this foliage, it also works on top of our subjects, right? It goes behind, it goes in front. So we'll work that in front, and then that goes both ways to a point, but it expands in a really neat way. You know what? I'll get you a lot closer for this next portion. So yet again, we grab some pigment with our damp brush. I'm making a series of small taps. They're connected. Here I'll have it kind of leaf up, but then other portions of it, perhaps on other branches, can start coming down. And I'm really not working much with actual strokes at this point. It's going to be fairly time consuming, but it should render some really wonderful results. Here we'll create a completely different branch. It kind of leaves up at the top, and then it dips back down. So movement-wise, quite different from what we have there. We also moved down before we started implementing it. We'll have some of these areas that kind of spin off. Now let's do one that moves in front. So I'm starting directly on top. We'll have it move down, say, to the left, and then perhaps the branch moves out this way, so it crisscrosses the actual tree. There we go. We'll add another small one to the side here, just to make it look more natural and organic. These can crisscross, that is important. And we can also go over previously applied areas to thicken the tops. It's going to make the pigment more opaque. It's going to make the branches look stronger, and you're not going to want all of your branches to be strong, but you are occasionally. There we go. So I'm kind of dancing around, jumping from area to area. Let's head down here. We'll have this one really go up. And then move down in this very organic way. I'm trying to be quite loose with my strokes, my applications. If you find that you are starting to do things very similarly, that you are kind of losing that organic nature to it, do hold your brush from much farther away and tap in that regard. I'm holding my brush currently quite close to the canvas, or at least I was prior to this, just because I wanted to brace my pinky finger on the edge of the canvas and eliminate any shake, but I think we're okay right now. Something you will notice as you go through the painting process and you forget just how much time has passed, you forget a meal here or there, you forget to drink your water, you will get a little bit more shaky. Not greatly, but to the point where you will notice it in your painting. So do make sure that you are having a little snack, that you're staying hydrated, staying healthy. It does make an impact on the painting process. And I find often the biggest mistakes are made when I've missed one too many meals. So do consider that. Hopefully breaking these lessons down into steps helps you take those breaks because you know exactly where to come back. When I was kind of redesigning these lessons, I thought about if I were to watch a painting tutorial, what exactly would I want? And breaking things down like that is definitely on my list. I don't know that I've seen it done before, but I thought it could work. And this is, I believe, our 4th or 5th lesson where we do break things down like that. And I think it's been quite useful. So again, if you do enjoy the step-by-step process rather than kind of jumping around in the entire, or rather in the entire painting, let me know. Always curious to hear your thoughts, your ideas. These lessons are made for you. They are made to teach you. They are made to make you happy. And again, I just love to know your thoughts. But with that, we are really just moving down our tree. Again, taking quite some time. I'm looking at the camera. This clip is over 4 minutes and we're just, not even done this singular tree. So recognize that it does take time, but you get some great results. I'm going to move the camera down a little bit more. That way we can continue with the rest of this one. Now, a lot of these trees have a pretty interesting habit in that the farther down you get, the larger your areas of foliage can be, the larger the branches are, and then right before we get to the bottom, say here, things just stop. So we end up getting these really large applications, and I'll make one here, then we'll go back up and fill the rest in. But we'll make this one quite large. Perhaps it's draping down from here. And then from there, nothing else. So here we are. Now we're going to do this from a little bit of a distance. And again, that's really just to ensure that we're not getting too wrapped up in the details, that we're not kind of losing focus of the general movements and composition, because that can happen when you get really invested in the fun rendering portions like this. You start applying, you want to apply more, you want to apply more, and you kind of do continue to, but again, we want to make sure that this tree and this tree look like they make sense together, that they look good together, and that's the current goal. So, working from a bit farther, we've seen how the detail is rendered, and now we're seeing how it fits in with that one. This is going to be really the centerpiece of the painting, so we want it to look quite nice. We're following the rules that we pre-established, that for the most part our branches aren't working on the left-hand side and then directly to the right. We move down a little bit. All of these protruding branches or implied branches need to be different. We're going back over previously applied areas to thicken the opacity. And we're occasionally creating some that move directly in front and zigzag back and forth in front of our tree. This is also hypothetically happening behind our tree, but of course we can't see it because the tree is in the way, right? So far so good. Also doing the occasional one that moves up. Here's another one that's moving right through the middle of the tree. I'm not at the point where I'm doing a lot of draping yet. And my brush is fairly damp, so that my bristles are very condensed, which is making applying all of these little applications quite simple. Alternatively, you could do this with a fan brush, but I'm probably not going to get the same level of detail in this because the fan brush's bristles clump together to be a little bit larger than this application. If we were using a very stiff fan brush, we wouldn't have that, and the applications would be even smaller than this because you'd essentially be getting individual bristles rather than a very small collection of them. So that's also an option should you want to, but this is going to give you the maximum amount of control. And I also wanted to create some variance between the fan brush applications in the background, which are more so for clusters of foliage, and this here in the foreground where you can essentially see each and every little leaf kind of layered on top. Or, not leaf, but a little extended piece of greenery. Sorry, getting a little distracted here. Admittedly, again, it's one of those portions of the process that's just really, really infectious. You can get right into it, and it's really all you want to think about or do. Really wonderful. With that, because we are now moving into a very repetitive portion of the painting, I think I am going to speed up a lot of the rest of the footage just for this step. I'll still show you where we're applying all of it, and we will do some close-up shots as well so that you can see that as well. But I think it's just about time. Now I did want to talk about this one right here. We have the tree, which is essentially getting lost in a lot of the foliage as we get down towards the bottom. So how do we show that if the entirety of the tree isn't in the light? Well, we're going to start at the top in the area that does receive the most light. We'll apply it in the same way we did before, jumping back and forth, making our branches slightly larger as we move downwards, doing a number of applications to thicken opacity, occasionally dancing over the middle of the tree. And you might even want to do this with a slightly darker green, or with slightly more water, that way it's more transparent and the darker base layer shows through. But here what we're essentially doing is getting to this area where it's all going to disappear. And when you applied your applications of the fan brush, you probably created small little clusters, and you essentially want these to go down and just get lost behind a cluster. So there's essentially a little wall there. Now there isn't one on this side for another little while, and that ends up being right here. So I'll bring this foliage down to there, and then it just kind of gets lost. And there's another one right there. We'll start this over the center of the tree. And it's probably very difficult to see, even on camera, but it's that subtlety that's really going to sell the piece. It's going to make it look a lot more interesting, a lot more believable. So we essentially just let it get lost right there, and right there. We created these shelves. We are using more water on our brush so that this mixture, which is the same mixture as what I used for everything else, is just less visually prominent. Because again, you do get that darker green showing through. And then I'll go back over the top a couple of times, build up that highlight. That way we do have a progression of light as you move down into the more shadowy areas. Not all that difficult, but, just a couple of different ideas to implement to create something really unique and interesting. Like that a lot, though. So now we're back to our mix, and what we're going to do is create a slightly brighter green than what we previously had before. Grabbing some extra green gold, titanium white. We are still going to be using a little bit of Mars Black here to desaturate that green gold. And then we will re-brighten it, just like we did before, with the titanium white. We're doing this very incrementally. We don't want something that is significantly brighter. Just a nice little highlight. So we'll go back in, we'll test it. That is brighter than what we had there before. And this looks like the correct brightness for that middle tree we were talking about. So this is actually perfect. We'll mix up a bit more of this paint with the 1/2" flat-headed brush. We'll switch over to the liner brush, and then we'll start applying it to very select areas. So jumping back into this with our liner brush, I'm going to begin more so around the bottom right-hand side of our centerpiece tree. And I'm going to work on some of the highlights on the tops of the clusters, because the tops are where the highlights, where the light in general is going to be able to touch, right? So this is going to bring the eye more so towards the center of the painting. It's not drastically brighter than what we had before, but it's definitely a step up. And then we can occasionally bring a little bit of it over into the other side, but I don't want to do too much, because I know I want some orange leaves on this side, and so we're going to be careful. We're not going to overdo it. We can always go back and add more. I think we're almost at the point where I am very satisfied. When we extend it out here over this darker area, you can really take note of it. I think that worked quite well. Create a couple little spin-off areas, again, that stretch a bit farther for that effect. And the areas at the top are, of course, going to be receiving the most light, so they should definitely get that treatment as well. And I'll do that on both the right and left-hand side, more so towards the top than I did the bottom. Great. Now we'll grab some of this, we'll add it to the tops of these over here. But not so much the bottom, because again, the farther we go down, the less light that hits the subjects. You have more shadows in the way. We'll have some up at the top here. Going to be a bit more sparing with these trees, because I do have another orange tree over here, and that'll capture a lot of attention. Though we do want to keep in mind the general rules of the painting, where that light should be, where it makes sense to be. And that's why we're still applying it over here. Just to a lesser extent. Maybe this tree's a little bit farther back than this one. Maybe it's a slightly different kind of tree that naturally has darker foliage, greenery. Could be a lot of things. Again, creating some of those extended, beautiful highlights. And I know we've been painting from a bit of a distance for a while now. But again, I just wanted to make sure that you had a good view of what it all looks like together with these highlights. With that, I think we're just about ready for our next step. Now, at this point, I'm quite happy with the shape of my trees, though I do feel like in the end they might be a little bit bright. Yours might be perfect, so this step isn't going to be for everyone, but for those of you who do feel like a lot of your trees are just a little bit too bright and you want to kind of add highlight in certain spots instead, what we can do before we move on to our orange and our other highlights, we can take the 1" flat-headed brush, we can grab a little bit of Mars Black, a little bit of our green gold, mix those together, We're going to grab quite a lot of water for our brush, mix this up to the point where it's essentially like watercolor, rather than actual acrylic pigment. It's incredibly thin, and this is only going to work when everything on your canvas is incredibly dry. But once you have it that way, we can start applying what's called a wash, and this is going to slightly darken all of our pigments. The goal here is to change the value, right, how dark or light it is, without changing the actual detail, which is why we make it as thin as we do, with the amount of water that we do. Just like that. I think I want mine to be a bit more dark than it is green right now. Mix that up. This is really quite dark, but with some extra water, we can move it out, and it won't be dark to that extent. The goal here is to get very even coverage. And again, this isn't something you have to do. This is going to be a case-by-case basis, but it's a really great technique to know in general. There we go. It also makes everything nice and cohesive. Brings everything together. It will make our darker foliage in the background a little bit darker too, which is nice. Just adds a little bit of extra depth there. And I really, really like what we did. So with that, now I'm going to let this dry completely, and then we'll come back in with some added detail in a second. Okay, so now that everything is nice and dry, we're going to go back with the highlight that we were using initially for this. However, now we're going to apply it in very particular areas that we want to pop, and this will change from person to person, but it's going to stand out to a much greater degree because everything else in the painting is quite a bit darker now. That glaze essentially gave this the opportunity to stand out in a way that it couldn't before. And so we're going in, we're trying to create a lot of detail. We're going to avoid any real monotonous applications or branches. Again, I wanted the left-hand side to stand out a little bit more, but we will apply a little bit over here on the right-hand side too, just not too much. We'll also go up to the top because that's where the most light is going to be received. And now we'll jump over to this tree yet again. There we go. Again, we're going to be sparing with it. I think the larger issue initially was that I wasn't sparing enough with my highlights, and they kind of ended up being everywhere, and no particular area popped the way I wanted it to. So, here we have a chance to remedy said mistakes. We've learned from them. Now we are implementing the fixes. There we go. I think that's really gorgeous. Certainly a lot better than what it looked like before. It's not as visually samey, which was the goal. Now we're just doing a little bit over here as well. Not as much. I am using more water, so it's slightly less prominent, though still brighter than the rest of the piece, especially in the edge, or around the edge. And I think we're just about done with this layer. From there, we'll take a couple steps back, make sure that the painting is progressing the way we want, and if so, we'll be able to move on to the next color and start to really move in the fall. right? Get some oranges in there. As an update, I did want to do slightly more with this area right down here. Not too much, but a little bit. Again, best to be honest with yourself and make sure you're really filling in every area that you want to before you move on. Might as well. Right? I think we've already put quite a bit of time into this piece. Let's make sure we're doing it right. Making it really what we want it to be. And that is what doing it right is. It's not necessarily copying the reference photo or the traceable perfectly. It's making the painting that you want to make. However that is, regardless of how many artistic liberties you'd like to take. Just enjoy the process. So now we're going to start working on some of the oranges through here, and we want to start with a slightly darker base layer. So I'm going to grab some of my cadmium red medium hue, move that to a new fairly clean spot on our palette. We are moving it over pre-existing paint, but it has dried, so it's not really an issue right now. We'll grab about double that in our cadmium yellow deep hue, and we want about double yellow because the red is a much stronger pigment, and to reach an orange you'll need significantly more of one than the other. Then we'll grab some titanium white. This will thicken the pigment and of course brighten it. So far so good, but it's definitely significantly brighter than what we need for that. So I'm going to grab a very small amount of Mars Black, and you do need to be careful with your Mars Black in your mixture here, because Mars Black and the yellow do end up mixing to more of a green, and that's why we need a fair bit of red in our mixture. But I think this could look really nice. Going in there, yeah, that looks fantastic. Though I do think it needs to be a little bit darker. Extra Mars Black. Get a really good mix, that way I don't have some areas that are more orange, some that are more red. There we go. I think that'll be great for our base layer. Maybe a bit more red. Again, we don't go with the first mixture we create. That looks really nice. Yeah, okay. So, we'll go in with this. We'll create some of our foliage with the smaller liner brush, and then we'll add some highlight. Alright, so now we're going to take that smaller liner brush, grab some of that pigment, and like I noted, we're going to have a fair portion of this other tree over to the right hand side of this one. And I'm just essentially going to follow my reference photo here. I can tell that there's this large branch, this large cluster, kind of gets lost behind this portion of the tree. Portions are going to go in front of the green one. Portions are going to go behind it as well. We're going to go with the less is more approach. We're going to tap on these applications initially. And I think they can actually start getting out a little bit farther, maybe to here, maybe to here. And you can plot in those points as well. That way you know where you're working to. Know how much room you have to play with. And it's quite subtle at this point. Exactly what we wanted it to be. Going to create a fairly large separation between these two. This is a different type of tree, different type of foliage. Do feel like you can play with it and have fun. Now we're going to skip some additional space. And you can see that I'm trying to jump around quite a bit. That way if I accidentally start doing the same technique or the same general movement, it isn't that obvious because these sections aren't right next to one another. I'll also have some of this over on this side of the tree to show that it does go behind. There we are. Have this going over some of our greenery. Continuously grabbing more water for my brush, that way these applications can remain nice and tidy, nice and small. Started to create a similar amount of space in between these two, so now with this one I'm going even smaller. Or rather, wider, the spacing in between. There we go. That looks really nice. I'm going to go up here and start thickening a couple of these applications. Start bringing some of it together. I think that looks quite nice. You can see how these kind of zigzag into one another, creating some cohesive movements, making it all feel like it fits. Then we'll have some that kind of leaf up right around this top section. Wonderful, really wonderful. Head over to the other side. Again, I want the majority over here, but we do want some to be a bit more playful. I think we'll also, with a very wet brush and not as much paint, so you can take some water, take off the paint there, we can incorporate some distant oranges over on this side. If you accidentally apply too much, just kind of work it out with your brush in the water and make it more subtle. Now what we're about to do here is going to be much more visually prominent than the subtle applications. We were just working on the right hand side of the canvas. So I'm back to using slightly less water, and I'm not taking off the paint on my palette before I go in with this. We want some of these to be more stark, while we want some to be more subtle, right? Here it's working behind this tree, partially in front. We'll find some openings in the limbs of the green. Just tap that in. We'll lead it back over towards this too. Lots of taps, changing the rotation of my brush, the orientation rather. That way I get some different markings, and sometimes I'm going in with a bit of a application on the side so that I get an elongated application, just to add some extra variance into the mix. We are going to go into this with some yellow a little bit later on. But we needed the orange base first, because the yellow is a quite transparent pigment, and if we were to layer it just on top of this green backdrop, we'd probably get more of a green, because the green would show through, and you'd get an optical blend, making the yellow look even more green. So we're just creating a base layer for our inevitable yellow, and we're also creating a base layer for our oranges, which we will want too. At this point, a lot of these are moving in the upward direction, and I do want to incorporate more that are moving to the side, like a lot of the rest of our foliage here. So I'm just going to incorporate some of those, make it look a bit more natural in our setting. Also create a little bit more down here. There we go. So those are the more important areas. Over here is how we did the subtle. I'm now going to move the camera back, and I think we'll do a little sped up section where I just fill out the rest. We'll probably do a true tree over on the left hand side, and then we'll do some really subtle applications throughout as well. So now that we have our base layer applied, we're going to create a bit of a brighter orange. So I'll actually mix this right on top of our last mix, that way we can see that it is in fact getting brighter. Add some titanium white. We do know that we need some Mars black in there. And we don't want it to be wildly brighter. We don't want it to be wildly more saturated either. We just want incremental upgrades. That way we can continue to build this should we want to and add additional layers. Generally, the more layers you have, the better the painting ends up looking. So, just take our time here. I think that looks really gorgeous. Add a little bit of extra titanium white. See how that works on here. Almost a perfect match. Really, really wonderful. It's a little too orange for these yellow ones down here, but we can start with this for sure. So, jumping back into this, we are still using our smaller liner brush. And now we'll be tapping this onto the top areas of these larger clusters, because the tops are the spots that are going to be receiving the real light. We are still going to be dampening our brush with some water. Hopefully not too much to the point where we really thin it out, but a little bit to condense those bristles will make this easier. And now, because we're layering one brighter value over a previously applied darker value, we are creating some extra depth. So we have a lot of depth happening in this painting currently. We have the darker base layer, then we have the darker trees in the distance, then we have some slightly more forward trees, bit brighter, bit more detail. Started working with that fan brush. Then we have these in the foreground, and we even have these orange ones working both in front of and behind them. So again, a lot of depth built up in this piece so far. Very, very satisfied. When I'm applying this, I'm going to try to remember that earlier I felt like too many of the applications were moving upwards. So I'm going in, as you can see my brush is more horizontal, and I'm trying to create a more similar application to what we had previously. Again, we don't want everything to be visually samey, but we do want enough variance in our painting that it is continuously engaging. There we go. I think that did it. Yeah, that's really nice. And if you find your oranges get a little bit too bright, a little too saturated, you can always go back in and add brighter greens later on. But I didn't want to go into too bright of greens because I didn't want to force us to make these a lot brighter or more saturated if we didn't want to. So we just kind of paste things out. Trying to create some little individual pieces that protrude different areas. Don't want too many highlights in behind here because of course it'll be catching more shadows from this tree. And these highlights for the most part are going to be in the middle, though we can do a couple off to the side, though it's going to be very minimal over here. Yeah, probably don't want to do much more than that. So, quite happy there. Let's grab some extra yellow. Let's grab some extra white. More yellow yet again. More white yet again. There we go. And with this, we'll apply some of these really bright little pieces of foliage down here. Now, this is not the same type as that, which is why it's so much brighter. It's not bright because of the light that's hitting it. It's bright because of its natural innate coloring. I love that. Really keeps the eye in the center of the piece. Don't want to do too much, but yeah. Wow. I am so happy with how that turned out. Really beautiful. Okay. You know what? Let's take a hint more. Let's add it to the bottom over here. And we are getting lucky. We have a lot of titanium white in this mixture. We have some orange. So when I'm applying it over the almost black, I'm not getting a green. Though that is something to watch out for. And if you are, make sure you go in with a more of an orange base layer, like we talked about earlier. There we go. Maybe we'll add a little bit up here. Trying to space it out just a little bit. There. Okay, so now that we have our brighter yellows and oranges, we can go back to our greens. I'm going to be doing this with the liner brush just because I don't want to do too much of it, and I don't think the fact that we don't have the ability to mix much paint will matter all that much. With that, we're going in with quite a bit of our green gold, our titanium white, the smallest hint of Mars black, and we're looking to achieve a brighter green than what we currently have here on the palette, which represents the color from our last application. So this right here is quite a bit brighter. So I'm going to soften it just a little bit value-wise by adding in some extra Mars black. As you can see, that made it a little bit too dark, so now we'll work in the other direction. And that can happen, you know, try to make something a little bit brighter, and you have to make it a little bit darker, then it's too dark. But hey, you know what? The more we paint, the better we get, the more we learn. It's not a bad thing. So here we now have our new green, which we're going to be very sparing with. Again, this is going to be reserved for the areas that receive a lot of light, and it's going to be reserved more so for the center trees in the piece, because of course we want a vignette effect to keep the eye of the viewer in the painting. The eye innately goes to the brightest point of any picture or painting, and if we can keep that center area, that main subject, brighter, then the eye will stay with it, and we will keep that attention exactly where we want it. Subconsciously, at least, right? So we're just applying this initially to the center tree. Same way we did with all of our other applications, lots of little taps. Trying to keep these predominantly to the tops of the larger clusters. I do think we'll go back later on and heighten some of these, but for now I'm quite happy. Okay, so far so good. really starting to focus at this point, because we want these highlights to not command all of the attention, but balance the piece again. Do a bit more of the highlight down here, perhaps. Yeah, that worked great. And then just a hint of it, just a hint, over on this side, but substantially less, because again, we want to keep that eye more so in the middle of the painting. There we go. So for our next step here, we're going to start working on the water right there in the background. We are simply going to be doing the base layer, so the gradient of the lighter bluish green to the darkish bluish green, and the reflections and all of the little leaves on top we'll do after. But with that, we're going to start by grabbing some of our turquoise green, and I cleared a fairly large spot here on our palette for it. We'll grab some titanium white, about half that Mars black, and we'll mix those together. From there, I think it's quite evident that this does need to be a bit more green to look like that. So work in some of our green gold. And it's definitely too saturated at the moment, so we'll go with more black and white. There we go, definitely getting closer. We'll do a little test. Okay, so at this point, I think it's still a little bit bright and maybe a little bit saturated. The Mars Black will fix both of those things to an extent. And we are so close. That's wonderful. Okay, still a little bit too saturated, so more Mars Black. But it'll probably be too dark now, so we'll add more titanium white. And that is absolutely perfect. So very happy with that mix. We'll now mix up a slightly darker one with some additional Mars Black. Try that in the background. Needs to be darker. And I like that a lot. So we'll use this for the distant area. We'll use that for the foreground, and we'll blend them together on the canvas. So we'll start by just grabbing some of that brighter pigment that we have. I'll create that separating line for the most part, right across here. And if we have excess paint on our brush, we'll apply a little bit of pressure and just start moving that upwards. If we don't have extra paint, we don't want to do that because we don't want to stretch out what paint we have on the canvas. We don't want to make it too thin, right? So we'll start applying that. I do realize that, you know what, we already need more paint. So we'll just mix this up pretty quickly. The more times we mix it, the better we'll get at kind of retaining that information. So again, nice to kind of start with a little bit. That way you force yourself to really get a good understanding for the mix. So if you end up painting something similar, you know, pretty beautiful palette, probably will want to use it again. If you want to do that, you'll be equipped. You'll remember. So we'll just apply this like so. Maybe with a bit more blue this time. It's definitely getting on the brighter side, but when we mix to the darker area, it'll definitely take that value down. Make sure that layer's nice and thick. And you know what, I think we'll extend it slightly farther up. I am going over all of my previous drawings. I am okay with that. We can always go back to the start of the lesson, look at the traceable, look at the reference photo. A lot of tools to work that back in. And now, I can tell that my darker pigment has started to dry. So I just mix up a little bit more. There we go. Going to work on my edge first, because when you have new paint, you have the best opportunity to create those sharp edges. The longer you paint for, the harder it gets. Because the brush starts to dry out, you run out of pigment. So I do recommend dealing with this line first. Then we can start moving down. Now, because our brush is nice and damp, we should be able to blend into our lighter mixture with relative ease. You can see that we're going over both. I'm taking this darker pigment, moving it down. Then we take the lighter pigment, we move it back up. And we get a nice, even blend. Now we're going to work on the base layer for the second half of our water here. And as you can probably see, this is slightly darker than what we have right here. It's not quite as dark as what we have in the top, but this area in the foreground, this mixture, does need to be slightly darker. And then again, we can go back and add a lot of the details. So we'll start by taking quite a bit of that blue, some Mars black, and I'm going to leave our original mixture up here untouched. That way I know exactly what we're going to be working beside when we get to the actual canvas. Mixing up a good amount of paint. It's darker. I don't think it's dark enough. A little bit more Mars black. Think we need a little bit of green as well. And you know what? That might be it. It's really good. It could use slightly more green. And I think we found it. Yeah, it's slightly richer. It's a little bit heavier in contrast, but that is what I want. So we're going to go in with that, and then we can start having some fun with more of the detail-oriented things. So jumping back into the canvas here, we're actually going to be significantly more careful with our applications than we were previously. As you can see, I am using that 1-inch flat-headed brush to do this because it does carry a lot of paint. Makes covering these big areas quite efficient, but I'm going to watch out for a lot of our drawing here. We could go back in, we could draw it. I know we just talked about that with the previous section, but I really liked the general flow, and I wanted to show you that you don't always have to go over your drawing. There are ways of being careful and making it work. I'm rotating my brush a lot. I'm only going in when I know I have a clean application. I'm working around all of these little branches. There we go. If I accidentally move over a portion, then we could go back in and draw it, or I could just move the subject outwards, the branch, and then have it beside where it initially was, which is kind of what I'm doing right now. There we go. I think that the colors ended up working out really, really well. So that's nice. I'm leaving a slight line in between both of them because I know I want it to be darker. And we just haven't mixed up that pigment yet. Have a nice wide open area we can fill out right here. Nice and easy. Now, I did just unload a lot of paint, so it's debatable whether I should go back in at this point and start crafting around edges. But I did feel like we had enough still on that edge and that the brush was still damp enough to do this relatively successfully. So we're going back in. Though if you feel like the pigment is hard to get off the brush or you're just not getting those sharp applications anymore, definitely grab some extra paint, wet your brush again. Will make a big difference if you do find that you're starting to have issues. There we go. Sometimes I'll even just paint with the corner of the brush, not even the full head. You can tell that there's a little corner in there. It's going to be difficult to get, but you know, we can go over portions of those branches. And in this scenario, it's better to make the branches smaller than it is to make them bigger. So do try to work with that. And if you feel like you're going to have to make the sacrifice on one side or the other, in that you're painting over part of the branch or you're leaving a portion of the water unpainted, paint over that branch. There we go. It's turning out really nicely. Quite satisfied. It's going to look, you know, not all that elaborate for a little while, but that's okay. There we go. Going to move back in between some of these. And what's really neat about this subject is the majority of it is going to be submerged. So it'll have a very nice cohesive color with the rest of this. Just taking a second, looking at how the branches move, where we have our separations. Saying, okay, you know what, it's time to move out here. And we'll fill that in. Make sure our brush is nice and damp. And I do think I'm going to run out of pigment, unfortunately. So we will have to mix more. Though, again, it's practice and it shouldn't be viewed as a bad thing. Also, we've been able to blend with a lot of these previously applied applications and areas with real efficiency. And I always get questions about my dry time, because often we are able to do that. We're able to do that on the canvas because between almost every application, I go back and I make my brush a little bit more damp. That water works its way into the brush, and it just allows me to work much more efficiently with my blends. The paint stays wet for a longer period of time. Now, I get the questions about, well, how do I keep the palette wet? Often, the palette actually does dry, and I have to go back and I remix more paint. Sometimes that's on camera, sometimes that's off camera, depending upon how many times I'm doing it and if it just gets a little too repetitive, right? When it's past the point of being informative. So that is something I deal with, though the dry time will change depending upon your geographical location and the humidity and so many different factors. But I've also known that, you can, and a lot of people do, spray their palettes with a little spritzer to keep their paints wet for a longer period of time, which is something that does work. I personally don't do this because I'm constantly adding more water to my brush and therefore to my paints already, and I don't want to kind of overdo the amount of water I'm working in, right? And if we're already spraying the palette and the pigments are already getting that water, then we're working with this additional amount, which may make adding water from our little dish unintuitive. So it's not something that I would say is wrong or bad. I think it very much comes down to personal preference, much like a lot of technique in art. But just recognize that it will impact the amount of water that you should add when you're cleaning your brush in between different strokes and applications, but also that it is an option, and it may be something that works really well for you. Might not work great for everybody, might not be a technique that everybody loves, but it might be worth a shot. So if you find that dry time is an issue, you can just get a little spritzer bottle, some water, and work that on. With that said, I think very happy with this. I'll take some steps back. I'll look at my reference photo, just ensure that it is what I want it to be. but I think this is a fairly good base layer. So now we're going to switch to our 1/2 inch flat-headed brush, and we're going to start working on the base layer for this really neat, again, submerged tree. So for this, I'm going to want one of the darkest pigments we've rendered yet. So I'm going to work beside this previously rendered dark pigment. I'm going to want it to have quite a bit more green because it's going to be a fairly mossy tree. There we go. I'll test it in here though. I know I'm going to want to make it darker. And that already is a really close match. Nice to see. We'll add some extra Mars Black. Yeah, okay. So we'll take this. We'll essentially paint out the entirety of this structure, and then we'll go on and start building some highlights, making it three-dimensional. So here we are, back at the canvas. We have our brush. It is nice and damp. I'm actually taking my pinky finger and I'm grounding it on my easel right now. And we're using that same 1/2 inch flat-headed brush for this because it can carry a decent amount of paint. As you can see, I'm getting through a fair amount of surface area. And because it has that nice sharp edge, which is fantastic for rendering subjects like this that do have those hard defined edges. I also like to use this a lot for rocks. So with that, grab a bit more paint. And you do have a couple of options in terms of application here. You can go for that tap and drag effect, which you can see me currently utilizing. We could do the actual just tap effect like we did for the trees earlier, if you want it to look a bit more rough. But I figure this tree is underwater, meaning it's eroded. We're probably not going to have all of those sharp applications that you normally see in trees. It's probably going to look a bit softer. So this is a scenario with a tree which is pretty unique. And I think here I prefer to make it a bit softer and therefore go into it with more of a drag. There we go. Get a good mix going. I will want to go over areas a couple of times just to ensure that they are nice and thick, well applied. And this is definitely one of the more easy portions of the painting. We're really just painting in the open areas. A little bit like painting by numbers, but nothing wrong with that. And, you know, we're definitely going to have our more complicated subjects and applications. So there's a flow to it. Sometimes you get to kind of relax. Sometimes you really need to mentally focus on your next step. And I think that both of which help balance being kind of creatively engaged and not kind of mentally taxed. So, again, happy to have the opportunity to do this here. With that, this process, while it may take a little while there is quite a bit of surface area, there isn't too much differing technique-wise. So again, I think I'm probably going to speed up some of the footage from here on out of this base layer specifically. And then when we get to building the highlights, we can chat about it. Hopefully you guys are enjoying the structure. If you would like to see less of the sped up footage or more of the sped up footage, I'd love to know in the comments. Again, I'm making this very much in the style of how I would personally like to see a tutorial. I'd like the information, but I also wouldn't want it to get too repetitive. I think some repetition is great because it means that we have an opportunity to really instill these ideas in our head so that we don't lose them. But at the same time, there are only so many times you really want to hear how a particular application is done, right? So, I don't know. Let me know what your thoughts are, if I should change this up. This is my first time doing a recording while painting in a while. We've been doing a lot of dubs on the channel just because I feel like it makes the painting process a little bit easier. I can paint faster, which I think can be more cathartic to watch. But I did get a lot of requests for talking while painting. So I figured, you know what, we'd give it another shot. Hopefully you do end up enjoying it. And I am happy to continue. I'd just like to know, format-wise, what's preferable. And then if I can accommodate, I will. But with that, I did intend to speed up a lot of this, and then we ended up kind of talking about format. Not necessarily a bad thing. Nice to just have an opportunity to have a chat, right? These are kind of ardent chats in a way. Nothing too formal. Never intended to be. There we go. I'm really trying to clean up the edges, by the way. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of white canvas showing through. Just a little area. I do try to take care of those. We will have an opportunity later on to do so as well. But it's just a good thing to kind of be in the habit of. When I get to these very small areas, I'll also probably switch to the liner brush. There we go. Yeah, and this is going to be tricky. We'll need either a lot of paint with quite a wet brush or a smaller brush to do this as efficiently as we can. There we go. We have a lot of these little showing portions of canvas, that white right around here, which again is something I know that I really want to work to get rid of. However, I don't want to extend the branch to the point where we'd cover all of that up. It would make the branch larger than what I would want. So I think I'm actually going to not follow my own advice there. I'm going to leave that. And then when we come in to do the movement in the water, I'll make sure I cover that up there. It's going to be a great step because it means if there are any inconsistencies that you have in your bodies of water or any unfinished areas that you have here, we'll be able to fill that in and just make it work. There we go. That said, this does extend up past. We did paint over portions of it. So I think I'm going to draw those in with some contact. Just finish this up. And then again, from there, you and I will get to rendering that depth, wrapping the light around these subjects, having fun with it. Now we're going to switch to our filbert brush. This one is about 1/3 of an inch, and I really like it because you have a sharp edge on top, but you also have these nice rounded sides, which makes blending really efficient. With that, we are going to now grab some paint. Our next goal will be making these three-dimensional, which means we need a greenish blue just like that. I'm going to start by taking some of our golden green, some of this, we'll grab some of our titanium white, and a hint of Mars black, not too much. Just like that. Go and give it a little test, and that is already incredibly close. Wow, we got quite lucky there. I think I might add the smallest amount of our turquoise green back into it. Maybe a hint of titanium white. But that was a really fantastic first attempt. And there it is. So with that, we are going to mix up a bit more of that pigment, and then we'll start applying it and creating those gradients along the edges to give it some real dimension. So now that our base layer has fully dried, we are going to take that filbert brush, grab some of our pigment. We'll probably brace our hand on the easel right here, just looking up at the reference photo, and I say, okay, you know what, the light's still coming down. We're going to want to apply this to the tops initially of these branches, like so. These two end up connecting here in the middle with one that's very elongated, like that. Start to fill it out, has a fairly large body right there. Finding the tops of all of these edges, that'll end up combining. This could even combine with that. And now I'm starting to run out of paint, which is ideal. So I'm going to take the remainder of that paint off my brush. My brush is quite damp, though it'll still have a little bit on it because I didn't clean it well. And now I'm just going to go right below those initial applications with a very soft touch and create a gradient. So it goes from light to dark. And you can even keep your brush strokes in here. You don't have to work for something highly pristine, because we are working on a very organic subject, right? It's not going to look absolutely perfect. It's going to have little nooks and crannies. It's going to have these organic movements. So here we go, fresh paint starting at the top. We need to continue to get that paint off of this brush, so we'll just continue to find subjects, more specifically the tops of them. This will lead back into here. That looks quite nice. This can lead back up to that. Starting to run out of paint, which is great. Probably shouldn't attempt these when they're so small with very minimal amounts of paint, because it's just very difficult to render that clean line. You should probably go back and do that with the liner brush in a little bit. So instead we'll stick with the big ones for now. There we go. And now take that remaining pigment off my brush. Again, we still have a little bit because we didn't clean it well. This will actually let me create some of these smaller applications too, which is nice. But we're predominantly doing this so that we can do a bit of a blend down. Using almost no pressure, trying to apply as little paint as possible. This very watery, greenish turquoise mix. So now, quite simply, we're working with a smaller brush for smaller details. And I would like to note that the painting is going to look fairly rough for the next little while. We are working with very simple base layers, some of which aren't going to be the most cleanly rendered, and that's okay. It's all part of the process, so don't get discouraged if your painting doesn't look exactly the way you want it to for the next little while. Even if you've been painting for a decade or two, this is a step that's going to look awkward, and it's just because the way we layer it, it needs to go through this process. So don't worry too much about it. We will get there. We will make it look great. Just need to trust in yourself, trust in the tutorial. We'll get it there. So, with that, positive minds, positive attitudes, ready. I'm just still moving through these very small little areas. My brush is quite damp. It's not a bad thing. If these applications end up being slightly more semi-transparent, less than opaque, that's okay. We don't need the green to be prominent. Here we're heading up. This one's rather fun. Just making sure it all connects. There we go. And now we can have some fun. This was actually meant to be a longer branch that goes on top of the larger one. So we'll just grab some of our Mars Black, a little bit of our blue, a little bit of our turquoise green, make it even darker again, hint of titanium white. Okay, and this was the branch, this was its base, and it needs to meet over here. There we go. Let me move the camera angle for you. So, as you can see, we now have this longer area which connects that to that. It is now a branch that works on top, but we need to define the top. So I'm going to take a little bit of extra titanium white and make a slightly brighter variant of our nice underwater mossy greenish blue. So mix right on top just so I can see the direct comparison. That is slightly brighter. We'll give it a go. We'll apply it on the top of this. We'll just kind of keep it going here, doing a lot of little taps so that it has a nice organic look to it. There we go. That looks great. That looks exactly how we wanted it to. We can take some more of this and through a series of taps add it to the top, the brightest areas of this underwater log here, or rather tree. So it's a bit more than a log, isn't it? So we'll just continue that. We'll add in some texture, give it some extra life, make it more interesting. It's in the foreground while it's underwater. You do want it to capture some attention, right? So we're not going to see all of the details, but we will see some. So I'm just slowly building up a little bit of that detail, especially in the areas that are a bit higher, raised in the water, right? So it won't be all of them, but it will be a select few. That'll really make the piece wonderful. There we go. Great. Alright, so the next step is going to be creating all of these darker shadows that we can see through the water, right? There's that dividing line that we purposefully didn't paint earlier. You can see little movements throughout it, even some back here. And so we'll use our filbert brush. Again, it's about 1/3 of an inch. Grab quite a bit of Mars Black. We'll grab a little bit of our green gold. We'll add some turquoise green, because of course it is that blue water, but we are looking for a nice dark pigment. We'll grab the smallest hint of titanium white. We'll give that a go. I think that it could be slightly more green. And I like that a lot. Okay, so we're going to apply this throughout our body of water, predominantly at the bottom, a little bit at the top, and then we'll also work that line in. So, jumping back into this, we have our darker pigment, and this is going to be our first test on the actual canvas. Hopefully it goes well. Oh wow, we actually have it working wonderfully. It almost blends into the bottom, but it is slightly darker, so exactly what we wanted. We don't really want this dividing line breaking apart all of our individual little branches, but we can go back and paint those in very easily. So it's not something to concern ourselves with. We're also trying to make sure that this line isn't perfectly even. It moves up a little bit, it moves down. Again, it's just a natural organic movement in the rock. My brush is fairly damp so that I can get these nice clean markings. And then you can see that I'm also moving my brush down so that we move this color throughout a little bit. Again, it'll look a little rough initially. I don't deny that, but we will get it to a point where it looks really fantastic. So with that, I decided that I wanted it to be slightly more blue. as we started to apply it. I saw it in action and I thought, you know what? Well, I thought in the reference photo it could be more green. I think in our painting it could be more blue. At this stage in the game, our painting's probably deviated from the reference photo with a couple of colors and maybe even subjects should we decide to take those artistic liberties. So it makes sense that at this point we work off the reference photo, but we do make pragmatic changes when it comes to the actual canvas. So here we go. We have our line. It is implemented. Our painting's looking rough as it is intended to, and now we start moving down some of these applications. There are a lot in the reference photo. I'm going to focus on the open areas of water here, at least initially. Lots of these little horizontal strokes. They're quite small, and we are going to need more pigment, so we'll grab some of our blue, our green, this time more blue than green. Hint of titanium white, and we're definitely going to need to darken this again. Try that. It's not bad. Actually, I like that. I like that a lot. Works well into our previously applied dark pigments. It's a little bit brighter. If you go over your branches a little bit, that is okay. Again, you can repaint them in, or this could be part of the moving water that goes above, create shadows and reflections. Though we'll talk a lot more about that in an upcoming step. You can see that I am changing this as we go, just little bit by little bit, keeping it captivating. There we go. Okay, taking a step back. Still a lot to do with that, but I just want to take it in. Yeah, okay. Okay, all is well. I do see where we're going with this. It's going to look very different in a couple of steps. But this is necessary. So like our textured background, something you implement that you don't intend to see in the end, but there will be subtle hints of it, and you want those to show up just almost subconsciously. So we'll take a bit more of this. We'll create some perhaps larger movements, being fairly loose up here. Going to try to soften things out, just going over them a couple of times with the brush very softly once I start trying to paint. Okay, so one more little thing I'd like to do just while we're working with these darker pigments is mix up the darkest pigment that we have up here. Again, it's very much of a turquoise green, Mars black, a little bit of titanium white. I think we'll give that a try. Needs to be darker. Give that a try. There we go. And I just wanted to make less of a stark contrast between these two, between the land and the water. I want it to be a bit more ambiguous as to where one starts and ends. So I'm just going to take this darker pigment, I'm going to work it up into our greenery and foliage with a tapping effect, and then at a certain point I'm going to work it down into a horizontal application. So we're doing both. A tap upwards and a horizontal drag once we're down farther. This does look a little bit darker than what we have in the trees, but part of that is just the lighting and the fact that this is wet paint. Wet paint generally looks reflective, and you can see what the color is to a more stark extent because it's wet, or it either gets too bright, right, because of a reflection. So two different things that can happen there. And with that comes the good reminder that if you're painting something that's quite dark, and you're saying, it makes sense that it's correct, but it's just not looking right. Sometimes the application is correct, but because of the lighting, it doesn't look that way until it's dry. So if you matched it to your reference photo, it's correct on your reference photo, and you're applying it to your canvas and it doesn't look correct, sometimes, you did everything right. You just need to let it dry. So don't course correct too quickly if you are quite confident in your mix, because there are scenarios like this one where your pigments, despite being fairly correct, are going to look a little bit off for a minute. So, yeah, just something to consider. Doing lots of these horizontal strokes, which eventually connect in one way or another. There we go. And again, looks messy now. It'll look a lot better in just a bit. Though I do want to now go back and add a bit more of that highlighted pigment that we had. Not too much, because we will have other subjects for our true highlights, but let's try that. We're essentially looking for that pigment. There we go. All right, so that looks a little bit better. Still a long ways to go, but nice to see. A little relieving, right? And we don't want to make it too high, because the goal here was to make the transition more ambiguous. So at this point, while I am really excited about starting to work on all of these reflections, before that I need to craft these smaller pieces of land which are right in between, our trees and our reflection of trees. Now this right here is going to be done through a couple of layers. We'll start with the darker base layer, which will be some Mars black, some of our green gold, hint of titanium white, very small amount. It is a dark base layer. I just want it to be a little bit more green than what we had already. And I can tell that that is pretty nice. Then, take even more of that green gold, less Mars black, tiny bit of titanium white, makes up a nice mid value. Need to make that a little bit brighter. A little bit darker. This isn't going to be our highlight, but it is what we're going to build our highlight on top of, and we'll see portions of it through said highlight. So now, let's build the actual highlight. More titanium white, and this time, some of our cadmium yellow medium hue. Also, the smallest hint of our red. I think that while I applied far too much paint there, that is very close. We'll add the smallest hint of Mars black. And I think that's what I want. So with that, let's go and apply our dark base layer and then move through the motions. So in the reference photo, we looked at one area in particular, and that was over here to the right-hand side of the canvas. But there are actually two spots like this in the painting. And this is actually going to move all the way off to the right-hand side. I'm going to get slightly more paint. And then we're also going to do one over here. Going to have it connect with our trees. So far it's very simple. It's just a darker base layer. And I'll have it move out to just about there. Okay, now take that off of our brush. We'll mix up more of that mid value, which we still have right there. Now, by the time you get to these, they'll probably have dried on the palette, but that's okay. We were really just trying to find those initial colors get an idea of how to mix to them, and build some visual references here on our palette. We could wait for this to dry, or we could just go for it. It's going to be up to you. But I'm going to go in with a little bit of a tap, lots of vertical strokes, rotating my brush slightly. I'm running this along the top of our last application, leaving the bottom dark. And as I run out of paint, I'm going to this side and just letting it dissipate into nothing. There we go. Do the same over here. And we let it, again, dissipate as we get towards the center. So let's get a little bit closer. Let's grab our liner brush and let's do some details together. Okay, so we're going to take that smaller liner brush, grab that highlighted pigment. We're going to brace our hand on the canvas. And then we're going to paint in individual little pieces of grass. It's going to vary what direction they work in. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's to the right, to the left. Lots of little crisscrosses. Brush is going to remain nice and wet. That way the bristles are nice and condensed. We can get the smallest applications possible. We'll have some that are kind of leading in here, just, get those leading lines in the painting. Subconsciously move the eye towards the center. And I'll do that in the more open area. Though we will have some that move to the left as well, or rather to the right as well, because we do still want it to look natural. And unless there's a very strong breeze or, a reason to push all of the grass in one direction, it's probably going to be a little bit more diverse. Though, it is your painting, and if you want it to be a windy day, it could be a windy day. Remember to just have fun with it, make it your own. If you'd like to, you're also more than welcome to just follow along. We all get different things out of the painting process. That's kind of wonderful. But with that, I think I'm quite happy with this area. We're going to move over to the one on the left-hand side. Okay, so here we are. Same brush, same pigment, opposite side of the canvas. Here at the edge, I'm going to have it move in towards the center again, just for those leading lines. And you know what, I think I'll start by just doing a lot of those. And then we can mix in ones that move in varying directions as we go. So, to start, it's very simple. This also doesn't have to be as bright as the other side. Alternatively, it could be brighter. What I do know is I want them to be slightly different, because while it's grass, having a different value is going to make it more interesting and diverse. Again, something you'll hear me say 1,000 times in these painting lessons, but something that should be said 1,000 times. There we go. Have a couple little stray pieces. Maybe they're quite large. Just out in the water a little bit. There we go. It's really interesting. Yeah, I like that a lot. Okay, so now we'll take some steps back, make sure it looks good, and then if it does, we can proceed with the reflections. So now we're switching back to our 1/2" flat-headed brush, and we'll grab some of our titanium white, move that to a clean spot on our palette. Obviously, at this point, there aren't really many of them, so try to find a spot that doesn't really have any wet paint at this point. From there, we'll grab some Mars Black, grab a little bit of our blue, hint of our green, because the water does have some green in it. We don't want this to stand out in a strange way. And then, we'll grab some more Mars Black again. Right now, we are working on the color for our reflective trees. So these right here. And I can already tell this is far too bright. So again, more Mars Black. Small amounts at each time. Don't want to go overboard. That worked quite well right there. Worked quite well right there. Quite well there. Though I do think it needs more of our blue. So we'll just mix that up. Make sure it's consistent. That's wonderful. It's quite nice. I think with a hint of green it'll be perfect. Okay, so back to the canvas. So we'll grab a little bit of that pigment. We'll look for our tree. Say, okay, it's right there. And we'll start tapping down our reflection. It's going to be widest at the top. It's going to get smaller as you move this way, because of course it'll be the opposite. And it looks like there's a shelf underneath the water here, and there is, but that means that the top of the water is going to remain the same. Now we'll go to the next one. We'll let the reflection be the most prominent at the top as well, and we'll let it dissipate as we get towards the bottom. So I'm getting softer with my stroke and just letting it fully dissipate. We're also, of course, going over our logs as well. Here, moving over to the left-hand side, doing more of the same. Though I would like to remind you that we're not doing this for all of the trees, really just the more prominent ones. The ones you feel like are in the foreground. And these have foliage stopping them right here, and then they kind of get lost. And you can see a little bit of it poking out. So I'm doing that, and I'm not always going to go all the way. Though we can cover this with foliage as well. So here I'll do an example of that, where we will cover the entirety of the line, and then we'll go back later and we'll add some foliage on top. We're going to soon work our way out of that awkward stage. I think 2 more. This one's relatively short, this one's a bit taller. There we go. And then we just have a small one right here, small one right there, small one right there. Excellent. Now at this point, it's time to start working on some of the reflective foliage that we also see down here. We're going to use this as a blueprint for our next mix. However, we're going to make it more green. And a little bit later, we'll also make a mix that leans more towards the orange side of things. Though there isn't actually much orange in here with the exception of the leaves that are on top. So we are going to let that color get fairly muddy, actually. That's a term we generally want to avoid when working with art, right? I think it can kind of be a bad word, but in this scenario we really do want the mix between both of them. So we will allow it to, really distort that initial color and subdue it. With that, we're using some green, and I think this will be really nice. Let's give it a test. Let's give it a go. Yeah, okay, so I like that a lot. I think it's a little bit bright, so we'll go into some Mars Black. Though I do like the green. I think the hue is correct. Again, I think that looks really nice, to the point where this is what we'll give a try. So now we're switching to our smaller liner brush, grabbing some of that pigment, looking at where our reflections are above. And then we can start that tapping process that we did previously for all of the foliage. And I can quickly tell that I do want this mixture to be more green than it currently is, and perhaps a little bit brighter. So we'll grab our brush, add some extra green, add a small amount of titanium white, and we'll give this a go. Grab more of that. Oh, that is wonderful. Yes, exactly what we were looking for. So again, remember that while your reference photo is incredibly useful, while color matching can make your life a whole lot easier. That, again, as the painting progresses, you may want to change your colors a little bit, just so everything does continue to match. If a previous color was a little bit off, or if you just decided that you wanted to work with something a little bit different. Now, I am still trying to match the top applications as best I can, so I would implore you to do the same. I'm sure ours look a little bit different at this point. That's okay. We are still moving over this, though the farther we get away from the actual subject, the less prominent the reflection is going to be. So I'm actually not going to do much more past that point. I'll work on this reflection for a second. We're going to add a couple other subjects, believe it or not, on top of the water still. So this isn't our final layer. This isn't what needs to bring it all home and make it look exactly the way you wanted it to. It, like many others, is just another step on that road. So don't worry too much about it, though I do think that it is starting to come together and this area is starting to look quite nice. So that's always reassuring. Grab more of that pigment. Quite a large piece of foliage here to cast a reflection. And then another one right through here. This is part of our tree branch here, which is actually protruding from the water. So I'll have to go over that area again with colors that aren't so green and blue. Colors that are more reminiscent of what the tree would look like when not submerged. And we will get to that relatively soon. There we go. I'm also trying to do a little bit more of a stroke with these applications rather than the pure tap that we were doing before, because I want it to look a little bit more fluid, a bit more soft. It's a reflection in the water. The water does have a bit of movement to it, so we're not going to get an absolutely perfect matching rendition of what was above. Though we do want to get the general idea of it. There we go. Just head over to this side here now. You can see that I'm getting a lot faster with my application. Not because I'm trying to rush, but because I'm getting comfortable with the idea of painting trees upside down. One of those things that will occur. One of those things that's kind of funny initially. But you do start to get it. It does get easier. Again, I'm just looking up at the reference photo, up at my painting, figuring out where these reflections need to be, and we're throwing them on here. There we are. Felt like that was a little bit stark, so I used my finger to soften it. I will always be a big believer in finger painting. I think it's time to start working on some of the more orange reflections. Now, for our fall-colored foliage and reflections, we're actually going to mix a very similar color to what we used previously, and luckily, we still have that right here on our palette. Now, as you can see, I am using the smaller liner brush right now to mix it, which is relatively inefficient, admittedly, because you just can't pick up much paint. However, we don't really need much paint. We're going to be doing a very small amount of this, and with that, we're getting pretty close to our color. That actually looks pretty perfect. We'll make it slightly darker, just a hint of Mars Black. Yeah, just like that. And we'll make this very watery, So when we apply it down here, it isn't as stark. You can tell just how subtle it is, barely noticeable, and we can get that same effect by just really thinning this out. Okay, so back at our canvas, we have our very wet liner brush. We have some pigment. We'll grab even more water. Say, all right, you know what? We need to start our applications right down here. And a lot of the actual branches move out horizontally with these orange ones, right? So I'm going to continue that idea. And remember, with the green foliage, it wasn't simply the tap effect that we used to actually render the foliage. It was more of a tap and drag. And that's exactly what I'm doing with this, which is nice because it gives us a little bit of a water movement effect. I'm also going to use my finger occasionally to move out that paint. That's going to stretch it, making it more transparent. But it's also going to move it about as well. So again, we're continuing that really nice moving water effect. And remember, you can move over this almost dividing line. There we go. Being fairly loose with it. Just trying to ensure that I'm matching the general area that is above. And of course, much like the green foliage, it dissipates as we move farther down. So there's just less and less of it. Grab some more. You can tell right there that we have a lot. I'm going to be a bit more careful because the water probably isn't moving to such a great extent right here. So I will be doing slightly more of the tapping effect. I'm not going in with the yellow though, because if we did, it would simply turn to a green on top of the blue that we're currently working with. So the orange, I think, is the correct call. And if we want, we can add some yellow on top of it a little bit later on. Build that up a little bit more. Define that other line a little bit. And as we move this way, you can move more into that horizontal stroke. It's going to be a little bit of a transition area. Now we're moving over here. And as you move closer to us in the foreground, things will just get a bit more loose. A lot more horizontal. There we are. Certainly coming together. Definitely still need some new layers, but it's looking promising. And I can tell that it really is going to be quite nice when we bring this to fruition. Now we'll be switching back to our filbert brush and creating some of the brighter movements and highlights that we have in the water. These are the areas that are protruding. They're catching a little bit of light as the water moves. And so we'll start with some of our blue. Grab some titanium white, a little bit of Mars black. And that is already looking quite nice, though I do think it needs to have some green in it. Test that. It's far too bright, but a very beautiful color. So I say, okay, you know what, if it's too bright, we'll just add some Mars black, see where that brings us. And now it definitely needs more green. So we'll head back there. I'm really just looking for the brightest colors that are moving atop that surface. So we'll try that again, and oh, that's quite nice, though now too green. So we'll throw in some blue. And I think this will make a lot more sense once you see me actually applying it. So just hang in there. A little bit more Mars black. And that is pretty perfect. Yeah, so not all that bright, but slightly brighter than what we have on here in the general water. I think it's much more noticeable down here. Okay, so onto the canvas. So now we'll take some of that pigment and head back in with our filbert brush. This is something that we can used to go on top of our reflections of our trees, of the foliage. You can see that it's slightly brighter than what we have previously incorporated here on the canvas. You can go over just about everything, but again, this is movements in the water. Just like that. I'm using the filbert brush because it has a fairly soft edge to it. So by relieving pressure as I lift off the canvas, generally I can get a bit of a blend that goes from very opaque in the middle to not opaque to fairly transparent on both the right and left hand side. So you get this really nice depth with it. Also going to take this on top of varying portions of our tree here in the foreground, a little bit over our reflection. It's going to unify a lot of these subjects. I think before it started to look a little bit messy, and it had to because all of those subjects existed together. But now we have an opportunity to bring things back to a very unified aesthetic place with, all of these details underneath, creating detail that, is subconscious. It's making the piece more interesting because you can't figure everything out upon your initial look. Things take a little while to digest, to figure out what you're looking at in the water. Also, for the record, if my general wording suffers a little bit at this point, I'm currently painting at, I think, 11:30 in the evening. And it's just one of those scenarios where I really love the painting, really want to continue the painting, not quite ready for bed. But my ability to kind of project information is not what it was earlier in the day. So I do apologize if, again, I'm a little bit slower, or, maybe the lesson's a little bit more comical, but yeah, I'm sure you understand. There are definitely those nights where you're really deep into a painting, you love it, you want to finish it, and you go for it. That's really where we are. So there we added in a lot of these fairly horizontal applications occasionally, bringing them down one into another. I think that looks really lovely. Probably do a couple more here in the distance, to the point where we're even softening some of this. There we go. Yeah, that looks great. Okay, so what happens next? Well, we now need to start implementing some of our fallen leaves, some of our foliage, on top of the water. So that is our next step. Now, before we jump into the next part, I would like to remind you that we are going to be working with some oranges, with some yellows. So this greenish blue water right here and this greenish blue brush are not what we want. We really need to clean this well. We need to clean our brush as well. That way we don't work these colors into those yellows and turn all of our oranges into greens. So do take a minute, make sure everything is quite nice and pristine, and then we will proceed from there. So now it's time for one of my personal favorite parts of this process, and that's rendering all of these very small fallen leaves in the water. We're going to start by mixing up a really nice warm leaf color, quite similar to what we've previously rendered in this painting. And again, we do have that kind of saved over here to the far side of the canvas. So here I'm mixing this up. I say, you know what, I like that a lot. We'll give it a try. It's a little bit more orange than what's on there, but I do want multiple colors of leaves. So you know what, we'll save that. We'll create a second, more yellow variant off to the side. And that might already be what I want. Needs to be slightly darker. We're going to add a small, very small amount of Mars Black. Perfect. Okay, so we've mixed this up with our filbert. We'll switch to our liner, and we'll start applying all of these beautiful little leaves floating in the water. So here we are from a bit of a distance, and I do want to apply this from a distance because it's another one of those processes that's just fun to the point where you might do a little more than you should. So I'm going to start with the liner brush, creating these very small horizontal strokes, and initially I want them to be quite opaque. So I'm really leaning into the canvas with the brush, trying to get as much paint off of the brush as possible without moving it to the side, because if you do apply too much pressure, generally you do move that paint out in a way that's not really going to be all that appealing. So we are being careful with it, but I can tell in the reference photo there's a fairly large cluster happening right there. So I'm starting with that, and I'm going to start with all of the notable areas here on the photo. But when we do start to run out of paint and we just are left with a watery brush, we are going to continue to apply, because the semi-transparent applications that renders a little bit later on is going to look like leaves slightly under the water. It's going to give us some additional depth and make it really special. I'd also like to note that while I do this, I am trying to vary the size of the leaves, as they would be varied. They would be different. Here I'm grabbing my more orange mixture. It's not making much of a difference, and we can play with that later on. But right now, I'm really happy with how it's looking. I think the blue and the orange are gorgeous. Complementary colors really make each other pop. This is going to be the step that really brings this bottom area together. And when we get closer to us, I'm going to make the leaves larger, because perspective is going to, let us see them to a more full extent. Subjects in the background, painted smaller. Subjects in the foreground, painted larger. It's a pretty simple idea, and it's a great way of getting some depth in there. So here we're pretty close. These are much larger. You can see that those are smaller. We'll create one kind of in the middle with a size that's right in between. There we go. Keeping my brush wet, but not too wet. Really far away here, we want these to be extremely small. Still just looking at the reference photo, figuring out where they all need to be. And speaking of the reference photo, again, you can get that untraceable up over on Patreon. It's a great way to support the channel. The channel is predominantly fan-funded, and it is because of the incredible people up over on Patreon that I am able to make all of these lessons, break them down into different steps, and really sometimes do the lessons 3 or 4 times just to ensure that not only the painting is great, but the actual pacing of the lesson and all of the steps are laid out in the best possible way. So to everybody who is up over on Patreon, thank you for making this happen. Say it in every episode. I wish I could say it 10 times in every episode. I don't ever want to get too repetitive, but I think that you are heavily deserving of thanks, and I will always be grateful, and I will always try my best to mention it, as again, you are the reason we're doing this. So thank you. Also, thank you to everybody who is just watching along at home, enjoying the painting process here. I love that we built such a wonderful, committed community. I always try to include little keywords in these lessons around the end, just to, something you can use in the comments to note that you got here, that you are one of the dedicated few who really got invested in the lesson, who wanted to learn all you could. I think generally it's about 8% of people who get to the end. I do get the analytics and statistics from YouTube. So if you're one of those people who made it this far, congratulations. Good for you. I think you are going to be one of the people who
really succeeds with this, because obviously you're actually taking the time to take it all in. So, hey, congratulations to all of you. And the keyword that we're going to go with this week that you can leave in the comments, you can leave just the word, or you can incorporate it in a sentence, up to you. But we'll go with flow. We're painting all of these little leaves flowing here in the water. It's a relaxed word. I think it suits this painting quite well. So, again, just leave that in the comments as an individual word or in a sentence. Up to you, get as creative as you'd like with it, but it's always fun to see who does get the words, and I am starting to see patterns with people as well, which is really, really fun. So, yeah, check that out. I'd also like to note, as we were talking about Patreon, again, this channel is predominantly fan-funded. It's a great way to say thank you, but it's also a great way to get things like the traceables, the reference photos. You can get all 5 of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. In it, we talk about composition, glazing, what brushes to use, how to blend your pigments, how much water to work with, talk about leading lines, complementary colors, different color schemes, really everything under that painting sun. And then I also have a bunch of ebooks full of traceables for those uninspired days when you know you want to make something but you're not really sure what you want to make. Some of them have reference photos in them as well. We have one on flowers. We have a couple on landscapes. There's another ebook that teaches you how to draw trees. That way you can paint them and, kind of come up with your own scenes. We also have an exclusive Facebook group where people from the community post their works and renditions, and it's great because it's a very friendly, kind, warm community, but everybody's kind of working on very similar things. So you can kind of pick up different ideas, different techniques, and it's just a great place to comfortably learn. So that's another perk up over on Patreon, along with the ebooks, reference photos, traceables, all of that. And if you're interested, there will be a link to it in the video description. I very much appreciate all of the support, but I also recognize that not everybody, can do that, and that's totally okay. If you're just here watching, I very much appreciate that too. Again, it's nice to just have you all be a part of our community. And with that, I think we got a little distracted there with a couple of things. This is coming along really well. I'm applying very minimal amounts still. I'm trying to work in different areas, keep it balanced. And once I feel like I have some in every area that I want, I say, okay, do I still want more of these in the painting? And if the answer is yes, I look at the reference photo, I say, okay, what are the most prominent areas? And then I'll go back to that. And then I'll expand to another area to balance it out, and I'll expand to another area, balance it out. That's very much the course of action right here. Oh, I think we'll do another big one right down there. I like that. Right on top of the logs, right? There we go. Kind of have a lead-in right there. I think I'll paint another leaf to continue that movement. And then I think I want to tie it over there. So we'll create another little pathway, rather implied pathway, right? Just something for the eye to follow. Not intentionally, but subconsciously. Just get them right back there. Different techniques to move those eyes. We've also stuck fairly closely to the orange color. We haven't strayed to the yellow much, so that is an option if we really want an area to pop, because then we'll have added contrast. Yellow is generally just such a bright pigment as well. Really commands attention. Here I'm also trying to move this back into that center area as well. So larger clusters here in the foreground, and then they taper and they get smaller as we move over here. Oh, lovely. Very lovely. Alright, so more pigment. And I'm trying not to skip too much here at the end, because this is where we really bring it all together. And in the very least, even if we're painting very repetitively, I think we're gonna just have a nice chat. You know, enjoy that painting process together. When I was going to university for art, painting, one of my favorite parts of class was just the social aspect. Having that 3 to 6 hour painting session to talk to friends, you know, art, so many other things. It was really wonderful. And I kind of feel like these videos, in a way, are an extension of those art classes, except now I'm teaching them. But I still love that conversation to be there. I still love that feeling and sense of community. I really get that. It's something that was very important to me when I was building this channel. I wanted it to be a positive place. I wanted it to be a place where we felt like we could all learn, but also in like a very casual, friendly way. I never wanted to have it come across as something that was, I don't know, inaccessible to anybody or unfriendly. And I've always tried really hard to just keep it. It's a good thing. So hopefully that's the feeling you get, whether you've been here for a while or this is your first lesson. But I think just having a conversation is a big part of that. So nice to just have this conversation with you. And I know you might say, well, you're kind of just, you're talking, Ryan. Yeah, but I do read the comments and I know what you guys say back, and there's definitely an ongoing back and forth conversation in that way. So yeah, I am very curious again though, speaking of conversation, what you think of this lesson in general and the way it's laid out. Again, broke it down into steps. That's something that I think is very efficient, something that, again, I would like to personally learn from, which is why I make the lessons this way. And that's something I'd like to keep. I feel like there's been a lot of positive reception to that. But all of the step videos I've dubbed over. So I did the painting, listened to some music while I did. Generally, you know, in the fall, probably some Counting Crows. Big fan of that band. But this is the first one where I'm talking while I paint, which is something I used to do quite a lot of, but it makes you paint a little bit slower. And I feel like I'm not as concise with my thoughts when I'm painting and talking at the same time. But again, you do get that, I think, personal feel, and we can point out fun little things and stop and pause. And so, yeah, curious how you feel about this over the voiceover. My feelings will not be hurt either way. Again, I want to make the best lessons for you that I can. Obviously, people are going to have conflicting opinions. Some people are going to want one way, some people are going to want the other, but I do want to see in general what's preferred. And, you know, perhaps we can make an impact with that in the future. Maybe we'll do a bit of both. I don't know. Again, always looking forward to hearing your thoughts. But with that, I think that this is turning out really, really nice. We are going to now move to some yellow, some titanium white. Mix that up. Much brighter. Yeah, let's give this a try. I know that this is a very prominent area. We'll start here. For the most part, you're going to want to apply this on top of previously applied orange leaves, because otherwise, if your stroke is a little bit semi-transparent, we're going to get a green, because the darker base layer will show through. So we're being pretty careful with it. There we go. Yeah. I like that. I like that a lot. Be very sparing with them. Be careful with them, right? But I think that worked out really well. I don't think I'm going to do any more, but I very much like what we have. And then I'll just finish it off with a couple smaller applications throughout, just to make sure it looks nice and finished. Really jumping around. Smaller applications in the back, slightly more pressure in the foreground. Oh, arguably too much with that one. Oh, you know what? I'm going to take a step back. We're going to honestly assess it before we take it out. Okay, I like it. And I think we can turn it into a collection instead of taking it out. So now it just looks like a bunch of them kind of cluttered together. Yeah, I like the added color in the middle. I think that worked really well. And it kind of made this line a little bit less obvious, which I like. It's still there, it exists, it moves the eye in the way we want it to, but less obviously. So that's great. Yeah. Okay, so with that, there is one more thing that I wanted to do there. We're going to see if we have any wet green on our palette. Okay, we've got a little bit. Great. Titanium white, Mars black, a little bit of our yellow. Grab some water. Create the reflection for your grass on both sides. Not something we've done yet. Try to make sure that the grass is moving in the same general way that it was previously. I know the camera is still pretty far away, but I want it to be, just so you can see how subtle a lot of this is. I think if we got up close, it would look a lot more heavy contrast, and you'd probably apply slightly more highlight, slightly more detail than you really want to. And I say that from experience. Whenever I get really close to the canvas, that is something I tend to do. So, yeah, there we go. Nice and subtle. I like that a lot. And with that, I think it's time for our next and final step. So the next step is the final step, and as per usual, it is touch-ups. Now normally I do leave a fairly large touch-up at the end because I feel like, you know, the painting goes on, we change one thing, we change another thing, we need to kind of balance them, and today, said big touch-up is the top area here. Initially, I wanted a fair bit of sky showing through, but the more we did down here, I realized that nothing value-wise, brightness-wise, matched that. So, what we're going to do is we're going to get some Mars black, some of our green gold, hint of titanium white, mix up a nice dark pigment, very similar to what we used initially for our base layer. We'll just work that up here. I think it could actually be slightly brighter. There we go. That's perfect. Okay, so we're going to lessen some of the openings, though we'll leave portions of them. You can see just a little bit right there, trying to keep it nice and natural, nice and organic. We'll also move quite far over here. And just continue to move these up. I do believe I'll leave a small portion of the sky over on this right-hand side, but I do definitely want to move this to be significantly more prominent. So far, I think it actually already looks better, and we haven't even extended the trees. So, I think it's safe to say we are on the right path. Have to love it. And I'm also doing a little bit of a blend, taking this down and then making, again, just a slightly brighter mixture to move up. That way we don't have a new harder line. in between. There we go. Almost there. And then we'll just fill in that edge, that corner. So, I like that a lot more. Definitely a step in the right direction. From there, we'll go back to our 1/2 inch flat-headed brush. Make sure it's nice and damp. Grab some titanium white, Mars black, a little bit of our green, small amount. And as you can probably tell, this last step is kind of a culmination of all of our other steps. Everything else we've learned, it's coming together here. We're having an opportunity to go over it yet again and to just ensure that we've kind of memorized these techniques, that we feel confident with them. There we go. Just moving this new highlight back down in a couple of different places. That way it's nice and cohesive. It is a little bit different from our first mixture, but that's okay. There we go. We'll move that one all the way to the top too. Make some of these nice and tall. So far so good. I think we'll also create some distant trees. Probably want to make it a bit darker though. So, Mars black. A little bit more titanium white, not much. You can also go in with a fan brush if you want that added level of detail. But I don't want the top to be too detailed, because I don't want to draw the eye there. I want to keep the detail more in the middle of the piece. So we're doing some of these taller vertical applications for the bodies of trees. And we might tap in some foliage, but we're not doing too much. Now we'll switch to the liner brush. Grab some of that green, titanium white, Mars black. Again, not optimal to mix with this brush because it doesn't have a lot of surface area, but we don't need that much paint. We're just extending a couple of areas. So I'm starting with the darker foliage, which means I need to expand these areas, the previous tops, a little bit, because now we're going to have areas that are even smaller, and we can't really get smaller than what we've already done. So we need to make them bigger so that the new areas look smaller. It's actually pretty intuitive. Now I do recognize that you are at quite the distance. Again, that was intentional. But again, the point is just so you can see how it's all coming together. We've done these techniques, you've seen them up close. You can go back to multiple portions in the video to see them up close again. Right now it's more about balancing the piece than it is the actual technique. There we go. And now I'll go back to some highlights. More titanium white. Extending previous branches and creating new smaller ones. Best of both worlds. Anyways, with that said, this is essentially the end of our lesson here today. It's been incredibly fun. I think that this is a wonderful piece to kind of end the fall season on. It's subtle, but
It's relaxed. We've got some great greens in there. Normally, a lot of fall scenes, they focus so heavily on orange and yellow and reds. We've done that this year for sure, but I wanted to do one that really took advantage of the oranges and the greens together, as well as the beautiful blues that we have in the painting. So here today, I hope that you had a wonderful time working on a very organic fall lesson that, again, did make use of some greens and blues, a little more unconventional. Hope you feel like you learned things, that you just enjoyed your stay again. I'd love to hear what you think of this painting, and of course what you'd like to see in lessons going forward, whether that's me dubbing or just having very in the moment organic conversations about the actual painting. I believe I just I used the word organic again. It's currently 1:30 in the morning, still just at the painting, but I know my words aren't working the way I'd like them to. Though, funnily enough, the word organic was kind of humorous when I was in university for art. It was a word that I think everybody overused all the time, and everybody was fully aware of it. But it has so many proper and very fantastic situations in art, and so many different types of art, not even just nature art and landscapes and scenery, but so many different subjects can look organic or can feel organic. So yeah, just one of those fun words that I think as artists we all use, and maybe we use a little bit too much, but I don't know, it's one of those things that I've actively decided not to cut out of my toolbox, just because it has this fun history for me, and I do think that it describes so many of these scenarios well. Though that's just another little story, and I hope you enjoyed those today too. Hope you enjoyed some of the comedy in the lesson with me making little mistakes, fixing them, having these conversations. I think that this piece really turned out wonderfully, and I'm actually incredibly excited for what we have coming next. I have 3 ideas for future lessons that I think you are going to love. They're very different from one another. We'll be using some really neat new techniques and doing some detailed pieces that we've really never tried before here on the channel. So make sure, if you haven't already, that you're subscribed, but also that you hit the little bell button. It gives you a notification when you sign on to YouTube that a new video has been posted. That way you don't miss it, doesn't get lost in your subscription feed, and we get to work on these paintings together again. So make sure that you do that for the future. And of course, if you'd like the traceables, reference photos, all of that, like help with the drawing process, the color matching process, if you'd like the ebooks or access to our exclusive Facebook group, there is Patreon. There is a link to that in the video description. So make sure you go and check that out if you're interested, or if you just want to support the channel directly. Again, these videos do happen because of you. I don't have to put just a myriad of ads throughout the video like so many others do. If you've ever watched another 2-hour video on YouTube, you probably had to sit through 18 ads in it, and it's something I never wanted to do, and something I never intended to do, and something that I don't have to do because of your direct support. So thank you for making these lessons not just full of so many advertisements, though I do respect artists and YouTubers who do put those in, because we do need to make a living, and it's not something I'd ever disrespect. It's just something that I personally didn't want to incorporate in these videos, and again, I'm very grateful to everybody who does support the channel directly, so that I don't have to, and you don't have to watch all of them either, right? So yeah, with that is our painting lesson for the day. Thank you for being here. The word, remember, is flow. You can use that in the comment section, either work it in or use it individually, but regardless, can't wait to read what you have to say, and I hope you have an incredible time working on this as well. I will see you very soon with a brand new painting lesson, And as per usual, as always, stay creative.